Oh, it's nice and quiet. It's nice and peaceful, which is unnatural for a lot of us, right? That's an unnatural state. Well, good morning, and we're going to finish our study this morning in the 15th chapter, and we're going to do it in kind of a haphazard fashion because, as you remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago that there was just a list of a bunch of towns, and I said we can skip that. But there's a couple of little things in the chapter I want to hit. Then we'll get into chapter 16, and it is very short, and it talks more about the territory. So hopefully we'll get through chapter 16 today too, and we'll let David get a fresh start in chapter 17 next week, as we're pretty quickly kind of rolling through the chapters here in Joshua. But certainly what we've been looking at the last chapter or two are territorial grants. We've talked about Caleb's grant. We've talked about different tribes' grants, and we're going to continue to look at that today, especially in chapter 16. But basically, the lands that God has granted the children of Israel, they're being apportioned, and the scripture is pretty specific on the boundaries for these lands. You don't want to have trouble between brethren. And if you weren't clear on the boundaries of these lands, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have boundary disputes, kind of like neighbors do today. Well, this is my land. No, this is my land. And but God is very clear through Joshua in delineating where these people are supposed to live. And we'll get into that more. But I did want to go back and look at the section in the middle of chapter 15 where we talk about Caleb's daughter. And I thought that was pretty interesting. We only got kind of into the hem of the garment on that a couple of weeks ago. So we'll kind of hit that right now. But let's first start and have a word of prayer. Kevin Cleveland, would you pray for us, please? So let's kind of go back to the 13th verse of Joshua 15, and we won't comment on some of these earlier verses, but just kind of get back into the story. And it says, "Now to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he gave a share among the children of Judah according to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, namely Kirjath Arba, which is Hebron." Arba was the father of Anak. Caleb drove out the three sons of Anak from there, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the children of Anak. Then he went up from there to the inhabitants of Debir. Formerly the name of Debir was Kirjath Sepher. And now here's where I like the story here. Verse 16. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kirjath Sepher and takes it, to him I will give Achsah, my daughter, as wife." So Caleb is saying, I need a little help taking this land that has been granted to me, and he is turning to any individual who will make the effort. So he's looking for a little bit of help to conquer, but also he's looking to expand his family by bringing in an in-law and bringing in that in-law's family. And you look at this and you think, Caleb's got a really high standing among the children of Israel. And to be married into his family, that would be a great honor. And to be a part of the tribe of Judah. And Caleb you would consider him one of the chief elders or the chief prince of the tribe of Judah. And Caleb was probably able to provide a good dowry for any young man who might want to attempt to be his son-in-law. And the job was pretty clear what he is seeking. But it's a challenge because apparently this city of Kirjath Sepher was a strong enemy. And this is the first mention of Caleb, that Caleb's had a daughter, by the way. Anything about the family. And of course, back in those days, there was great care on choosing a husband for a daughter. And the head of the household, no doubt, had the final say. And this was Caleb's way of showing that he would have a worthy son-in-law if they would go and fight for this land. Let's look at verse 17. So Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, took the challenge, and he gave him Achsah, his daughter, as wife. He took that city of Kirjath Sepher. So Caleb had been a brave man, so it's likely that his brother would have been as well. And here is his brother's son, Othniel. Othniel wins the battle. Caleb keeps his word. He doesn't deny his daughter. And so Achsah becomes his wife. And of course, today we would look at that as very shaky, would we not? They're cousins. They're cousins. But Caleb's a man of his word, and he follows through on what he has pledged. Verse 18, now it was so when she came to him that she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. So she dismounted from her donkey, a riding woman, there we go. She dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you wish? We've talked about dowry, that comes along with the daughter in the wedding. And it seems here that Caleb is willing that she name her own price. So she asked him for a field. And that's what I'm saying. This is probably part of a dowry. But it looks like that Caleb gave his daughter the power to say what her dowry might be. What would you like to go along with your husband? And that's what happened. I'm sure Othniel also was interested in his property, in this field. And but she is the one that makes the request. So she comes to her father in a very humble way, and he understands that she is seeking something, and he is willing to move ahead. And it seems from this that Othniel had got himself a very smart wife. She's looking out for their future by asking for this piece of land. And she asked her father for this field for herself and her husband. And Caleb is very willing and loving toward his daughter. Let's look at verse 19. This is where we'll wrap up this part of the story. So she answered, give me a blessing. Since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water. So he gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Now, he had given her what was called a south land, but it was a dry land. It was almost probably desert land. It was exposed to the south desert wind, which was very hot and dry. It probably came from the deserts of Arabia. So she needed, if they were going to use this land, if this land was going to be something that they could make a go with, they had to have water. So she asked for, she called springs of water. These would have been something that would have come with a great price if you were trying to irrigate dry lands. It would cost a lot to irrigate these lands. What she's asking for is not a small thing here, but she asked for it and for a good reason. And he is willing to do it. Again, he loves his daughter. His daughter's smart enough, and his new son-in-law is smart enough to know that they need this. So they talk about the fact that she asked for springs of water, and he does give her upper springs and lower springs. And that means that these are springs in both high and low grounds. In most cases, some people think it could have been that there were springs in two fields that were given to her, but probably one above another. They were in two different geographical locations so the ground was well irrigated. And the way it looks, they were very close to what we call today the Negev Desert. No wonder that there was desert south winds coming on this land and drying it up. That's why they needed the springs. The springs would bring water to their dry land. And this would cause their land to flourish. They could grow and they could support themselves. And Caleb does grant his daughter's request. So a small little story there among the whole of this chapter. But I think it's very interesting, the love that Caleb had for his daughter, the willingness to support her and her new husband, and also the fact that once again, Caleb is shown to be a man of his word, an honest man, a good, righteous man, and he's only taken what he was promised as far as his original land grant, and now he is so loving to share it with his family, share it with his offspring. And it's a blessing for his children and a blessing for the future generations. I want to look at the last verse here. Oh, go ahead.
You must have been a pretty good job.
Yeah.
He became the first judge of it.
He did. He became the first judge, and he was a good one. I mean, you look at Judges, he was a good man. No wonder he came from Caleb's family, even as a nephew. I'm sure Caleb's influence was good with Othniel, and he was a good one if you go back and study his time in the book of Judges. Now let's look at the last verse of the chapter. And this is an interesting one because it talks about the original or the ancient inhabitants of Jerusalem, the Jebusites. Matter of fact, Jerusalem was originally known as Jebus. That's why they were called Jebusites. Well, let's look at this verse. Again, these are Canaanites. And these are Canaanites that weren't necessarily conquered. Verse 63 says, "As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day." So did they have peaceful coexistence? That could be. So the inhabitants of Jerusalem were descendants of the third son of Canaan. This is found back in Genesis 10. Joshua killed their king who had joined to that pact against Gibeon. We remember back from chapter 10 of Joshua. The Israelites called the area Jebus until David ordered them to capture the city and make it their capital. And it's always been known now as the city of David. But Judges 1, it showed that the Israelites conquered Jebus and they burned it, but the Jebusites later regained control. And that's what we're having described here in this last verse. Of course, who was an early king of this region? We just studied about him on Wednesday night a couple of weeks ago. Melchizedek. Then it was called Salem. Salem or peace. But he had controlled that area. Of course, he was a king and a priest, as we've often discussed. He was a very early king. Of course, he was a believer in the true God when this place was Salem. It's not clear whether the Israelites were unwilling to drive the Jebusites out or they could not because of the disobedience possibly. God might have withdrawn his help. So in any case, this is a kind of a sad note, concluding this account of Judah's allotment, because this was supposed to be their city. This was supposed to be their land. Eventually, it sort of does become their city, become their land, thanks to the work of David. But apparently there were some problems when they tried to take this city. So the Israelites did not manage to run the Jebusites. They had lived together. They coexisted in Jerusalem. And the Jebusites seemed to eventually mingle in with the children of Judah. Now, there are some Bible teachers who compare these Jebusites to some Christians in the church. They're there, but they're never totally committed. True. They attend services, but they don't work to further the kingdom. And is sort of how the Jebusites are kind of seen. They weren't going to do anything necessarily to help the children of Israel. They just kind of lived there, and they kind of lived together. So that's sort of a sad bit of the story there, because they were supposed to be conquered. They were supposed to be cleared out as God had commanded, and they weren't. And so you have sort of that uneasy truce that's there. And eventually David takes care of business, though, and he takes that city, and it never leaves his control. And it never leaves the control of Israel or Judah until the Assyrians and the Babylonians come around and they take the land because of the sin that was in Israel and Judah at the time. Any other thoughts on chapter 15? Well, we'll start verse 16, or chapter 16. Again, it's a short chapter, 10 verses. And basically, it's just talking about more land for tribes. And today we're going to talk about the tribes that were based on the children of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And of course, we've studied about that because they already had claimed some of their land on the east side of the Jordan River, but they had lands over on the west side as well. And we'll look here. So chapter 16 begins that the lot fell to the children of Joseph from the Jordan by Jericho to the waters of Jericho on the east, to the wilderness that goes up from Jericho through the mountains to Bethel, then went out from Bethel to Luz, passed along the border of the Archites at Ataroth. So we're starting to find their land, the land of the children of Joseph. So, and it talks about a lot being drawn. We've kind of talked about this before. It seems like they had preferences for land, but it also, the idea of drawing a lot means that probably you had to stand in line, and if the lot fell to you, okay, it's your turn. And you can make this claim, or you can seek this claim of land, and it can be granted to you. Everyone did not maybe necessarily get the land they wanted. They didn't get everything they desired. But if it was your turn to take land or to pick land, that's what takes place here. Now it's the children of Joseph. Of course, Joseph was beloved of the children of Israel and the great things that he had done for them. And by his children is the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh we're talking about here. So they get quite a bit of land. From Jordan by Jericho, we've studied about Jericho, by the water to the east. So they're getting that area that Israel first conquered when they crossed the Jordan. This was the southern border of the lot. For the tribe of Benjamin, it was Jericho, in which Jericho was. They had Jericho that lay between Judah and Ephraim. And the border began at the Jordan River, of course, which flowed near Jericho. We know it was 4, 5, 6 miles to Jericho from the river. And so further information is given. They go into a wilderness called Beth Aven there that's talked about in the first verse. This is the kind of area that goes kind of north. And of course, Joseph's sons received 2 allotments. Ephraim and Manasseh's land spread between Jordan at Jericho to the other side of Mount Bethel. And they received this portion by lot. Now, verse 2 said it went on through Bethel to Luz, pressed along to the border of the Archites at Adaroth. So this land is again considered going north, and it's maybe not as large as the other tribes got. But again, some of them have already received their land across the river. Now, verse 3 says, and went down westward to the boundary of the Japhlethites as far as the boundary of lower Beth Horon to Gezer, and it ended at the sea. And they basically have gotten a strip of land now, going from the Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And we have little descriptions here. For instance, it talks about Beth Horon, which is about 12 miles from Jerusalem. And then it talks about to Gezer, about a day's journey from Beth Horon. There was an area there that was later called Emos. We've heard that in the New Testament. And this was kind of the land that they were being given. And then it says the outgoings there were the sea. We're going all the way west to the Mediterranean Sea. And then verse 4 says, so the children of Joseph, Manasseh, and Ephraim took their inheritance. Again, they had their chance. They had their, you almost look like it's a baseball game. They had their time at the plate. The lot fell to them. They made their choices. Their choices are given to them. And that's what we're having described here. But again, one half of Manasseh is not involved with this because they're already settled over on the east side of the Jordan River. This was something that was actually settled way before they crossed the Jordan. Moses actually made this determination. He said, this is what you want. Well, this is what you're going to get. And so the half tribe of Manasseh is over there. Remember, they were obligated, despite the fact that they had their land east of the Jordan. What were they supposed to do? And they did. They had obligations to help their brethren fight for the land. They had to come across the Jordan and become part of the army of the children of Israel and battle for the land. That was sort of the deal that they had with Moses, especially. That they were not going to leave their brethren without proper arming, proper fighting, proper manpower, and they did that. So everyone's happy now, at least among Ephraim and Manasseh, and their land is taken. Yeah. That is so true. So we move on to another group here, starting with verse 5. And the border of the children of Ephraim, of course, part of Joseph's heritage, according to their families, was thus. The border of their inheritance on the east side was Adaroth Adar, as far as upper Beth Horon, and the border went out toward the sea on the north side of Mikmethath. That's a good one. Then the border went around eastward to Timnath Shiloh and passed by it on the east of Janohah. So this is Ephraim. We talked about Manasseh. This is Ephraim, another son of Joseph. He was the second son of Joseph. Manasseh was the firstborn. And and it's interesting that he actually received the opportunity, or Manasseh's tribe received the opportunity, or they got the first pick, apparently, of this land here. And that's what seemed to happen as now it's Ephraim's turn. So, and it was difficult to separate Ephraim's northern border from Manasseh's southern border. So they stayed together almost as a family, being heritage of Joseph. Their lands were together. And there's kind of an imaginary line between the two. The eastern border was the Jordan, and their western border reaches to the Mediterranean Sea. So there's two strips of land that Ephraim and Manasseh are holding, and they kind of cut across quite a bit of what we would say today is Israel, right through the middle. And it's quite intense. So again, it said the border went out toward the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, to Mikmatha on the north side, and the border about went eastward to Tinoth Shiloh, and passed on it to the east to Genoha. So again, we're getting a lot of these cities named that were old Canaanite cities. These were cities that had been fought over. There had been, in some cases, some bitter battles, but Israel in general controlled these cities. They controlled these lands. And now it's time to kind of dole out the spoils of war. But you have to remember that, again, these are all promised lands. And they've been living for decades with the hope that they would have these cities. And now we're getting these names. They're kind of lost in the fog of history. But to these people, and when you're apportioning these lands, this was important to them. This is what they had waited for. This is what they had fought for. This is where they had kept their faith in the covenant alive. And these cities, we read their names and they may not mean a lot to us, but man, it meant a lot to them, the children of Israel. No matter the family, no matter the tribe. And these cities that we're reading now, and these regions that were being discussed here, they meant the world to Manasseh. They meant the world to Ephraim, because this was their future. This was their futures for their families and for their tribe and for the nation in general. And it's important that they get this right. They get the borders right. They get the apportionments right. And that's why they're very careful. Verse 7 says, then it went down, talking about this land of Ephraim. It went down from Janahah to Adaroth, and Narah reached to the Jordan, to the Jericho, and came out at the Jordan. Again, this is the eastern portion of this land. So we have these cities being named here. Talks about a city named Janoth and Adaroth. And these are villages. So for instance, Naroth was a village of the Jews 5 miles from Jericho. And it's the village that Josephus in his writing called Nera, where there was water. This was an important place because, man, you could find water there. There was probably a spring or a well there. It was so important to Ephraim, I'm sure, to have this steady water supply. And they turned this land into something that was something to be proud of. It was probably not very attractive at the start, but their ingenuity, the blessings of God come together, and they make this land. And this verse 7 says it came to Jericho. Again, they're working in the Jericho region like Manasseh, and went out at Jordan. This again was the eastern border of their land. So Jericho was the southeastern border, though, of the land of Ephraim. The names of these cities were changed. When the Israelites took these cities, they had old Canaanite names. If you're trying to establish a new life, you don't want to have these old memories or these old Canaanite reminders in your face every day. That's why they changed the names. They changed the identities of these cities. And they probably make it kind of difficult for the Canaanites to even consider taking them back, because they have a whole new existence, they have a whole new identity, and they're very very deliberate in what they're doing here in taking these cities and creating this new life. I mean, there is new life being brought into these locations. Verse 8, the border went out from Tapua westward to the brook Kenna, and it ended at the sea. This was the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Ephraim according to their families. You know what's interesting, a lot of the Bible scholars say there's a little bit of confusion, because these names of some of these either regions or cities are used multiple times. It seems like the Canaanites had their families had kind of scattered over lots of these lands, but they revered a lot of their ancestors, and they named these cities after them. And there were multiple cities with the same name, and it gets a little confusing, and it takes a good Bible scholar to kind of keep a lot of this stuff together. Now, it says that Ephraim's land went unto the river Kana. Elsewhere in the Bible, it was called the brook Cherith. And Elijah hid himself there. We find out in 1 Kings 17:3. There were reeds that grew in this land, and apparently Kana meant reeds, or there were reeds on the banks of it. And the goings out, the scripture says, were to the sea. So if the river Kana was the brook Cherith, this could be part of the Dead or Salt Sea, actually. So we're getting a little expansion of the land, but it's never called the sea. That's the Mediterranean Sea. It seems like pretty much every time the sea is mentioned here, it's talking about the Mediterranean. So the scripture says this is the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Ephraim by their families. That is the description of the border where these families are going to live. And there are cities that are not even mentioned, but they're going to be inhabited as well. So this is the border again that actually joins their brethren Manasseh. The river Kana is one of those places. And a lot of the historians say that this is a river that sometimes dried up, that it only ran a lot of times during the winter season when there would be precipitation, and it would have something to fill its banks, but there are other times that it did not. Now we go into just the last couple of verses in chapter 16. The separate cities for the children of Ephraim were among the inheritance of the children of Manasseh, all the cities with their villages. So the tribe of Ephraim was much larger than the half-tribe of Manasseh. Again, Manasseh is in two sections or two segments, east and west of the Jordan. And the population of half-tribe Manasseh on the west is smaller than the tribe of Ephraim, which is all over on the west side of the Jordan. So besides the lot to fell to it, describes of the boundaries of Ephraim, there were several cities given to it as well. But there were also ones that were shared with the children of Manasseh, this scripture tells us. And they were around the borders of Ephraim, but again, they were cities that as brethren they could both be a part of. And it said cities and villages as well. These are the little towns that were adjacent to larger communities. And there were cities in the inheritance of Manasseh that were actually divided from the land of Manasseh. Again, these were like almost like little outlets or little colonies away from the main Manasseh land. But they were actually in Ephraim. That's what's being told here in this verse, that there were apparently some lands and some towns that were being shared. And to me it makes sense, because again, these are brethren. Yeah, they're different people, Ephraim and Manasseh, but they are descendants of Joseph. So in my mind, they're brethren, and they should be able to share these things and should be able to enjoy these things. But there were parts where Manasseh had a possession that were actually in Ephraim's land, and vice versa. These tribes were obviously very closely connected because Ephraim and Manasseh were brothers, and their land was joined. They're not separated by another tribe taking land. They're all together there. They're like a unit. And that is something that they seem to prefer, something that they seemed to enjoy. So we'll wrap up the chapter with verse 10. And they did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwelled among the Ephraimites to this day, whenever this was written, obviously, and have become forced laborers. Another instance here, just like Jerusalem or Jebus, where the Canaanites were not driven out. So Ephraim was unable or unwilling to take these Canaanites out of this area. And this actually is the first major mention of the policy of neglecting to exterminate idolaters. And we know that this was something that was serious with Jehovah. They were told to clear it out. They were told to utterly destroy these people, dominate these people. Don't let them live. Don't let them hold on to what they have. Yet, it's quite clear here in verse 10 that Ephraim allowed these people to live on for a price. So it appears that, again, Ephraim just did not follow God's commandment to remove these people. They kept some of them alive. Now, these people were under the control of the Ephraimites. And the Canaanites that survived apparently had to sort of pay a tribute to the Ephraimites. And again, this is showing that the Israelites just were not committed at times to fulfilling God's command.
In some ways, we're still paying for that today.
Yes. Many of the Canaanite descendants or some of the people we're dealing with now. Exactly. And it does say that this tribute was forced labor. It doesn't say slavery. In other words, they had to work for the Ephraimites to hold on to a place there in the Ephraimite territory. So they were able to survive. It wasn't their land anymore. They didn't control it, but they're still there. And because they're still there, that could be trouble. Are they going to plot against the Ephraimites? Are they going to plot against Israel in general? That's a problem. That's why God wanted the Canaanites to be utterly destroyed. He wanted to get the problem out of the way. God knew best. And Israel, as time goes on, fails to follow these commands. And we see great evidence of it here. We know it's going to lead to trouble down the road as Israel sins. Israel gets into idolatry. Israel intermarries with the Canaanites, and that brings trouble of its own. So these are the things that when we don't follow God's commands, trouble follows.
Verse chapter 15 says they could not drive out the Midianites. How was that? Would not or could not?
Well, if it's could not, that kind of shows there must have been some sin. There must have been a lack of faith. If we take that at face value. Well, thanks for your attention and comments. David gets to go with chapter 17 next Lord's Day.